Hello, scholars. Before we get going, I want to talk briefly about copyright. Most of the images in this video I got from Pixabay, which is a great site which allows you to use images without giving attribution for them. Thank you, Pixabay, and the good people who upload photos there. I've also included some information from different sources, and I've tried to put where that source came from along with each of those images or the information. Okay, and I've also used several things that are totally under copyright because I needed examples of advertisements. Now, I hope my use of these will fall under fair use, the provision of US copyright law that grants a little liberty to educators. If you don't feel it's appropriate, let me know. I'll make some revisions for the next time around. Let's go. Now think, if you will, about that 3 pounds of marvelous flesh sitting inside your skull, your brain, and then ask yourself this question: how logical am I? And then ask, how logical are the people around me? If I'm being honest, I've got to say that even though I want to be logical and think I should be logical, I'm really not. All the research that I've read shows that humans are far less logical than we should be, that we're more likely to be governed by our emotion, in as much as it's even possible to separate reason and emotion. And of course, I'm using this heart to represent emotion, even though I don't think your heart has much to do with it. What this means is, even though I know it's not good for me, I'm likely to make bad choices like eating too much cheesecake, or giving into purchases I shouldn't make, that sort of thing. Now, let me share just a quote from a podcast that I like. The host here is interviewing someone in the advertising field. Listen to what he says.
By assuming a world of perfect information where anonymous actors with stable preferences seek to maximize their expected utility in a series of standalone transactions, I freely admit, in such a world, which may exist in a parallel universe somewhere, there will be no advertising agencies.
Because why, Roy? Because all the information is already there? Because one's preferences can't be shifted?
Because if everybody knows what they want and is absolutely committed to attaining it, and they know perfectly well that they can perfectly trust the person from whom they buy it, you don't need a marketing function. The fact is that those conditions exist in the real world somewhere between very, very rarely and never.
So, if we all knew exactly what we wanted, and what we wanted was good for us, and we were committed to getting what we wanted, and we had perfect information and could trust the people around us, there would be no need for advertising. But those conditions are a dream. And here's the credit for that podcast if you would like to go listen to it. Now, we live in an environment that's complex, it's sophisticated, we have a lot of information coming at us, a lot of choices to make, and that environment is very different from the environment that our ancestors grew up in and lived in. Now, our brain is not a robot or a machine, and it is far better suited, perhaps, to living in that environment of our ancestors. This means that we're likely to look towards the short term rather than the long term. It's why we're more likely to fear being killed in a terrorist attack than in a swimming pool, even though far more people die in swimming pools than in terrorist attacks. Now, I don't want to be a calculator. I don't expect you to be calculators, right? We're people, and that's okay. But it is useful to recognize that there are some cognitive biases, some limitations to our thinking ability, some places where we're likely to get fooled and we're likely to get manipulated. And in particular, people who want to sell something, be that a product or be an idea, can manipulate us. So we might end up buying and consuming something that may cause us long-term health problems, or we may end up electing someone totally incompetent to be the president. That's Warren G. Harding, by the way. I don't know who you thought I was going to put on the screen, but he was a lousy president, incompetent and crooked. He got elected because he looked good. Now, for our vocab this week, I want to talk about some terms, and next week as well, some terms to try and build up your toolkit of evaluating and labeling some of the ways that people try and manipulate you into buying products or buying arguments or buying ideas. This week specifically, we'll look at some classic propaganda techniques. Next week, we'll be looking at some logical fallacies. And if I can work it in, at some point, we'll be looking at some other persuasive techniques and perhaps even doing a little bit with some behavioral economics or some cognitive biases, things like that. Now, again, the idea here is that we have a toolkit of terms that can help us recognize when people are trying to manipulate us, and also to help us make persuasive arguments for good and to avoid making faulty arguments that can't stand up to scrutiny. Let's acknowledge that advertising is not inherently bad. If you've got a product that may be useful to people or pleasurable to people, then you absolutely have every right to let people know about that product. In this case, nothing wrong with advertising pork except maybe for the pig, right? Now, the same can be true with ideas, that there may be ideas that are worth advertising or ideas that are worth persuading people of. If you've got something good you're trying to convey, then absolutely you should use every ethical, moral technique available to you to do it. Okay, on the other hand, we know that advertising can be used for bad purposes or even evil purposes. Now, when we're talking about advertising for an idea, we tend to call that propaganda. So here's a definition of propaganda: information, ideas, or rumors deliberately spread widely to help or harm a person, group, movement, institution, nation, etc. And this is coming to you from dictionary.com. If you want to put that simply, propaganda is deliberately manipulating how people think or how they behave. Now, we tend to use the word a little more neutrally, perhaps, than it was used in the past, when it had a very negative connotation. And I think still, if you use the term propaganda, the connotation is negative. Again, advertising can be used for good, it can be used for evil. And many of the techniques that you'll see here could be used legitimately for good purposes, again, but they're also meant to plan people's sort of cognitive weaknesses, if you will. Now, the techniques we're going to cover here are the basic 7 that were labeled or named by the Institute for Propaganda Analysis, which was a group of social scientists and, I believe, reporters that was formed in 1937, and they published a pamphlet until 1941. And their goal was to try and call out some of the manipulative things going on in advertising that they feared were impacting gullible people in a bad way. Now, I found this quote that came from The Fine Art of Propaganda, which was a book published by the Institute for Propaganda Analysis, and I liked it. It says, it's essential in a democratic society that young people and adults learn how to think, learn how to make up their minds. They must learn how to think independently, they must learn how to think together, they must come to conclusions, but at the same time they must recognize the right of other men to come to opposite conclusions. So far as individuals are concerned, the art of democracy is the art of thinking and discussing independently together. So we need to be thinking people, thoughtful people, people who don't swallow crap, right? But we also need to recognize that other people may disagree with us. And as a democracy, yes, we hold our individual opinions, but we also work with other people to discuss those ideas and to come up with good ideas. Now, that's very different from the following. This is perhaps an evil dictator's propaganda playbook. Okay, now if you're trying to not create a thinking populace, if you're trying to get people to blindly follow you, then you'll avoid abstract ideas. You're simply going to appeal to people's emotions. You're going to constantly repeat just a few ideas, and you're going to use stereotypical phrases, the things that stick in people's minds, the things that are easy for people to shout without really thinking about. You're only going to give one side of the argument. You're going to continuously criticize your opponents, and you're going to pick out one special enemy to vilify. Now, I read online that this was Hitler's playbook, but I've never actually read Mein Kampf, so I don't know exactly how he lays out his stuff. But you can see how, again, if you were trying to create a populace of people who would follow you blindly without actually thinking, you would be doing these things. All right, so let's cover those propaganda techniques that were labeled by the IPA, the techniques that if you've seen any propaganda techniques before, you've probably seen. All right, first of all, how would you guys feel if I called y'all dumb teenagers? That wouldn't be very nice, right? That would be an example of name calling, where I'm using a negative or offensive word to label you. Now, we could do that with a person, we could do that with an idea. Okay, but we're going to associate something with this really negative thing and use the language to support that. For example, we might label a politician as a wimp. Now, the thing about name calling is that it can get kind of fun, and I shouldn't say fun. The names can kind of stick in your head. So I found these examples from some course materials for a university. We've got President Barack Obama saying this was the election a couple years ago. He'd asked the middle class to pay more in taxes so that he could give another 250,000 tax cut to people making more than $3 million a year. It's like Robin Hood in reverse. It's Romney-hood. And of course, Mitt Romney said, if I were to coin a term, it'd be Obama-loney. Great examples, right? They stick in their mind. They're fun. The problem, of course, with name calling is that it's not really a great way to argue if you're actually trying to prove a legitimate point and not just take cheap shots at people. So here is, I love this, it's a hierarchy of disagreement, and this is based on the essay How to Disagree by Paul Graham. And you can see how it gets smaller at the top as people disagree with other arguments. You see a lot of the cheap stuff at the bottom. You see fewer of the good stuff at the top. But ideally, if you disagree with someone's point, you come up with legitimate reasons why that point is wrong, their main point. Now, you go down the list, you can disagree with just parts of the argument. You could maybe provide a counter argument. You could simply contradict what they say. You could attack their character and say they don't have the credibility to talk about this. That's an ad hominem attack. We'll talk about those next week. Okay, but they're at the very bottom. You're not even addressing the argument itself. You're just saying something like, you're an idiot. Again, it's easy to take those cheap shots, but if we're going to be logical, thinking people who are genuinely trying to make good decisions for the benefit of everybody, we need to try and not get suckered in by this kind of stuff. So here's a question. If you're listening to a politician or you're watching an ad and you see an instance of name calling, what could you ask yourself to try and keep from getting manipulated by the cheap shot? Now, here are some questions that I thought were really good from propagandacritic.com. So first you say, what idea does the propagandist want me to associate with the person, group, or idea? Does the idea in question have a legitimate connection with the real meaning of the name? So when we call Mitt Romney a wimp, what are we implying about him? What does the word wimp even mean? And when we're talking about his leadership, what does that have to do with being wimpy? Now, is this an idea that serves my best interests, being dismissed through giving it a name I don't like? If, for example, by wimpy they mean the desire to compromise, that may be, you may actually really like the desire to compromise, and calling it wimpy is unfair and doesn't serve your best interest, right? And then just if you were to cancel out the name there and think about what the actual argument or the actual idea is, would it still have merit on its own? Now, of course, it takes a calm, rational person to sit down and think through this kind of stuff, but it's worth giving it a try. Now, if I were to ask you what's the most common propaganda technique you've seen, you'd probably all say the term bandwagon. Bandwagon is the appeal to follow the crowd. It's to say, join in because everyone's doing it as well. Now, if you want to be fancy, because you know the term bandwagon, you've been hearing that term since elementary school, I'll give you some fancy Latin. You can call it argumentum ad populum, which basically means the same thing, but it's saying if everybody believes it, it must be true. So take your pick, bandwagon, or go with Latin. Either way, it's good, right? Now, this bandwagon appears in so much advertising. So here's an iPhone 5 ad. Loving it is easy. That's why so many people do. Or in this mascara ad, America's favorite mascara. No wonder one is sold every 1.7 seconds. Oh man, I gotta get some now. Okay, or you might see it here, over 1 million Australians, or over 95 billion served. That always confused me. I was like, is that 95 billion people or 95 billion hamburgers? But you know what? I think it's 95 billion hamburgers, because I don't think there are that many people in the world. Okay. Now, you can see that this technique is used a lot, so I just would like your opinion. Why do you think people use it? I mean, they must use it because it works, but why is it that it works so well? Here are my thoughts. People are social creatures. There's no denying that. Research shows that people who live longer are the people who have a good family and friend support system. If you are lonely, you're probably going to die sooner. Now, think back to our distant ancestor there. If he's on his own, he's going to have a tougher time finding food. He's going to have a tougher time dealing with enemies. He's going to be much better off if he's in a group. So a group offers him a sort of social safety net. Now, if he's looking around at his group members and they're all eating that particular mushroom and they're surviving, that tells him there's a strong chance that he's going to survive as well. So he's going to take his cue from other people in that group. Now, it's the same situation today. You can look around and take your cues from the people around you and know that if everyone else is wearing that particular fashion, you're probably going to be safe from mockery if you do it too. Now, let's say I told you about a fabulous new drug that can cure all your migraine headaches all the time. I'm sure you'd be excited. I know I would. But I hope you and I hope I would also ask what the side effects are. Or suppose I present to you my tax plan, which is going to reduce taxes for everyone, not increase the deficit, and not reduce any kind of government spending for social services. Again, sounds good, but I hope you and I both would be asking for the other side of the story. When someone only presents the information that's positive to their perspective and leaves out the bad stuff, that's card stacking. It's selective omission. Now, of course, we can do the opposite here. We can present the stuff that's bad about the other opponent and leave out the good stuff as well. That also counts as card stacking. Now, here's how that might look in advertising. We've got Kellogg's Cocoa Krispies, which I'm sure are delicious. And you see the big thing down there that says, now help support your child's immunity. 25% daily value of antioxidants and nutrients. It's got the vitamins that are really big. So when you look at this, what you're seeing are the health benefits of these Cocoa Krispies. And what's in very, very, very small print, because it's required to be there, is the amount of sugar in it. So they're presenting the good, they're leaving out the bad. Let's be honest, guys. If you're feeding your kids Cocoa Krispies for breakfast every morning, you're not helping out their long-term health. Now, here's a question. Why is it easy to be fooled by card stacking? I'd say one issue with card stacking is if you want to call someone on it, you have to have a complete enough knowledge of the subject to realize that there might be another side. So in the case of headache medicines, I need to have enough experience with medicines in general to realize that usually there is some kind of side effect or some kind of limitation on it. Same thing with politics. The reason that people are able to disagree about things is because most political plans have positive and they have negatives that come along with that. But if you're inexperienced in a field and with a particular topic, sometimes you may not know the questions you need to be asking. You may not know that there is another side that you need to be asking about. Plus, of course, it's easy to believe what we want to. We all have confirmation bias, which means if someone is presenting the good stuff, the stuff that we already believe or the stuff that we want to hear, it's a lot easier to swallow it. All right, consider this statement, if you will. English is the most useful class you'll take in high school. I know you guys are all nodding your heads and agreeing here. This statement is an example of an assertion. An assertion is an enthusiastic or energetic statement that's presented as fact, although it's not necessarily true. When I claim that English is the most useful class you'll take in high school, that very well may be true, but it might not. On the other hand, I'm presenting it as if it's a fact. Assertions appear in advertisements all the time. It's when you see things like the best coffee for the best you, or America's favorite XYZ. And when you look at political ads, they are full of these as well. Let me throw a word up on the screen. Is there anyone here who doesn't like family? How about prosperity or democracy? Anyone here against prosperity or democracy? How about justice or education or making America great? These words are all examples of glittering generalities. Glittering generalities are words that have different positive meanings for individual subjects that are highly linked to value concepts. Now, what does that mean? You can see this pretty ring here. It looks very nice on the surface, and yet if we were to try and crack into it and see how much it's really worth, it might turn out to be fake or empty. You might think of glittering generalities as being a bit like donuts. Again, on the surface, they look delicious nutritionally. They may be bankrupt once you try and break them down. Now, glittering generalities show up in ads all the time, particularly in campaign ads. Here's a screenshot from one from the 2012 election. Now, I'm guessing there's no one who's against freedom, but I'd like you to pick it apart. What does the word freedom mean to you? What might the word freedom mean to, say, a gun rights advocate or to a bank executive? And I'm thinking of the people who kind of wrecked the economy back prior to 2008. What about to a Black Lives Matter activist or to a white supremacist group? How can one word have these different meanings for different people? All right, next up, testimonials. Testimonials are quotations or endorsements in or out of context which attempt to connect a famous or respectable person with a product or item. In other words, you look at that Proactive ad, you see Adam Levine, he's good looking, you know who he is, and he tells you that it helped his skin and got rid of his acne. Now, testimonies we frequently think of being associated with famous people, but again, it could just be regular people who've used the product and find the product good. And if those regular people are sort of trustworthy, then their testimonial might be worth something. Now, I read reviews all the time, and I think there is absolutely nothing wrong with getting endorsements from people who've used the product and who like the product. But why might you need to be skeptical about testimonials? Well, I can think of a couple reasons, and one is for logical fallacies, this would be called an appeal to false authority. It's when you have somebody endorsing a product who really doesn't have the experience or the credentials to know whether that product's good or not. And here's an ad for Sanka, which was like a decaf coffee. And the spokesperson here was an actor who played a doctor on TV. So they were using his fake credentials as a doctor to try and sell this product. Now, of course, beyond that, you could have people sort of faking their testimonial. They're getting paid for it. They don't really care about the product. So it goes. Let me try a little experiment. Let's say I put a picture of James Dean, a young, hot movie star, and then I add a little bit of grammar. Would that make you feel sort of warm and fuzzy about that grammar? If so, I've successfully used the transfer technique, which is an attempt to make you, the subject, view a certain item in the same way as you view another item. In other words, to link the two in your mind. So the idea here is we take our warm, fuzzy feelings about James Dean and we slide that onto the grammar. Or it could work negatively. So in this case, we might take the negative feelings we have about Hitler or about Lenin and slide those onto the picture of President Obama. Now take a look at this ad. How is transfer being used here? Now note that this is not really a testimonial because you don't have, you have Britney Spears actually drinking the Pepsi, but you don't have Ray Charles or Michael Jackson actually drinking any Pepsi and saying that they like Pepsi and that it makes their life better. What you have, though, is images of these cool musicians, some of whom were considered pretty hot and sexy back in the day, okay, and you're associating them with your product. Now, I gotta say, I don't know about Britney Spears or Ray Charles, but as far as I know, Michael Jackson did not like Pepsi. He didn't like the drink, and he didn't like the company, particularly after his hair caught on fire while filming a Pepsi ad. He sued, by the way, and then donated some of the money to the burn hospital that helped him out. Take a look here. You recognize that famous movie star pushing the cart? I'm guessing you don't, because she's not. This is an example of plain folks, which is an attempt to make the public believe that the advertiser, the propagandist, shares the views of the common person and that the propagandist is working for the benefit of the common person. And we certainly saw that show up in the ad Journey about Bill Clinton. Now you explain this one to me. I don't know the answer. Why are people persuaded by both ads involving rich and famous people and ads involving regular Joes? And which type of ad do you think works better? Of course, there are many other propaganda techniques, and some would look at these basic ones identified by the IPA back in the 1930s as perhaps being a little bit too simplistic, but I think they're a great starting point. Now, if you look here, some of the ones listed here we will be talking about when we talk about logical fallacies. You can see they go on and on. Now, labels have their benefits, right? They help you see things that maybe you wouldn't have seen otherwise. But you don't need labels to look at something and say, there's something going on here that's not completely logical, or somebody's trying to push my buttons. So whether or not you have the terms, as long as you're thinking critically about what's going on,